this video, I want to talk about what to expect and not to expect from a Sherlock Holmes short story, using A Scandal in Bohemia as an example, one of my favorite stories. First of all, what you can expect from a Sherlock Holmes story is something very comforting. There's a sort of narrative arc that is common to all of Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories on Sherlock Holmes. Holmes and Watson very rarely encounter violence of a 21st century sort in the stories. They very rarely risk life and limb. They discuss the mysteries of a particular case in a cozy, fire-lighted drawing room on Baker Street that is strangely comforting because you know what to expect. And they discuss how they might solve the case. And then they methodically proceed to solve the case. You know that Holmes will be successful. There's no question about that. The only question is how he manages to be successful. And you also know, or should know, after reading a few of the short stories, it's not likely that you're going to be able to guess how the mystery is solved, because Doyle makes it impossible to determine in most cases. But that doesn't seem to hinder the enjoyment of the reader. You know that the story will follow this very predictable narrative arc. Watson always begins the story and narrates the entire story. He meets up with Holmes, usually at Baker Street, and Holmes astonishes Watson by noticing something about him that leads him to draw conclusions about Watson's whereabouts that day or his thought processes that day that absolutely astonish Watson because of their accuracy. "How do I know that you have been getting yourself very wet lately and that you have a most clumsy and careless servant girl?" "My dear Holmes," said I, "this is too much. You would certainly have been burned had you lived a few centuries ago. It is true that I had a country walk on Thursday and came home in a dreadful mess, but as I have changed my clothes, I can't imagine how you deduce it. As to Mary Jane, she is incorrigible, and my wife has given her notice, but there again, I fail to see how you work it out." He chuckled to himself and rubbed his long, nervous hands together. "It is simplicity itself," said he. "My eyes tell me that on the inside of your left shoe, just where the firelight strikes it, the leather is scored by 6 almost parallel cuts. Obviously, they have been caused by someone who has very carelessly scraped around the edges of the sole in order to remove crusted mud from it. Hence, you see, my double deduction that you had been out in vile weather and that you had a particularly malignant boot-slitting specimen of the London slavey. As to your practice, if a gentleman walks into my room smelling of iodoform, with a black mark of nitrate of silver upon his right forefinger, and a bulge on the right side of his top hat to show where he has secreted his stethoscope, I must be dull indeed if I do not pronounce him to be an active member of the medical profession." And invariably Holmes is correct, and Watson has to admit that when it's explained to him, it all seems very simple. Almost immediately from that point, Holmes proceeds to tell Watson about his latest mystery. So this type of structure is expected by the reader, and Doyle does not disappoint or surprise. And of course, Watson invariably is invited by Holmes to help solve the mystery. Now, in A Scandal in Bohemia, this structure is already in place, even though this is one of the very first stories that Conan Doyle ever wrote. And it involves a woman named Irene Adler, which is kind of unusual for Doyle. He rarely has women as central characters in his plots. But Irene Adler, as important as she is to the story, is not really shown as a three-dimensional character. We see Irene Adler from the perspective of Holmes and Watson. In other words, there is no revelation of her character or personality or what happens to her after the story. The story begins by the incredible statement that Irene Adler is always the woman to Holmes. Well, the logical question then is, wow, what did Holmes make of her? And when will we see her again, at least in Holmes's imagination and his mind? And the answer is we never see her again after the story is over. And so this is kind of confounding to 21st century minds. I mean, if she's so important to Holmes, why is she important? And what kind of person was she? And surely she must have been thought about by Holmes in some subsequent event, or maybe he somehow made contact with her or something. It's a logical thing to conclude, but the fact of the matter is that we know Irene Adler only by her statements and by her actions, not by her thoughts and not by her character, and certainly not by her history, which is given in only a very limited sense.
As to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than he. The king may do what he will without hindrance from one whom he has cruelly wronged. I keep it only to safeguard myself and to preserve a weapon which will always secure me from any steps which he might take in the future. I leave a photograph which he might care to possess, and I remain, dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, very truly yours, Irene Norton, nee Adler. "What a woman! Oh, what a woman!" cried the King of Bohemia, when we had all three read this epistle. "Did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she not have made an admirable queen? Is it not a pity that she was not on my level?" "From what I have seen of the lady, she seems, indeed, to be on a very different level to your Majesty," said Holmes coldly.
An example of how Doyle is very bad at portraying women. He portrays them as basically stick figures, one-dimensional characters who are there to move the plot along, to react in emotional ways to the plot lines, but never to be thinking persons themselves who might psychologically be important to the story. Of course, Irene Adler does turn the tables on Holmes, and he doesn't completely win the case, which is very unusual for a Holmes story, but he does win the case in the end in this particular story. So once again, the thing you can always expect from a Holmes story is that Holmes will come out a winner in some sense at least, and he does in A Scandal in Bohemia as well. He does not succeed in his immediate goal, which is to recover a photograph that Irene Adler has of she and the King of Bohemia in a compromising position. But in the end, Holmes does manage to reassure the king that Irene Adler will do nothing with this photograph to endanger the king, and the king is completely satisfied. So that at the end of the story, Holmes is not satisfied, but he has accomplished his main objective, which is to help ensure the king's reputation. But Holmes is put out by the fact that Irene Adler has fooled him, and the implication is that a woman has fooled him, and that makes her the woman. So it's very well structured, but in terms of portraying women, it's just another example of how Arthur Conan Doyle and the Victorian writers of his generation were certainly not liberated men in any sense of the word.
And that was how a great scandal threatened to affect the kingdom of Bohemia, and how the best plans of Mr. Sherlock Holmes were beaten by a woman's wit. He used to make merry over the cleverness of women, but I have not heard him do it of late. And when he speaks of Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, it is always under the honorable title of the woman. End of story.